message for tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Y'all all have a good Christmas? Let's try that one more time. Did anybody have a good Christmas? Good, good. We had a great Christmas. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. Get to spend time with the kids and grandkids and all that. It's a lot of fun. We got back from Branson and bad news. We went to Branson and Mary and I bought a joke book, and so I talked to Johnny just before the service, just before we started. I said, Johnny, I've got this joke. You think I'll tell it? He said, boy, you're on your own, buddy. He said, it's up to you, but he said, I'm going to stand back. You know, if you want to tell it, go ahead. And so I'm going to go ahead and tell the joke, okay? We need a little humor this evening to start out with, so here's the joke of the night. Don't feel obligated to laugh if you don't want to, okay? The question is, what kind of cars are in the Bible? What kind of cars are in the Bible? Well, first of all, Jehovah drove Adam and Eve out of the garden in a fury. Okay, didn't say they were great. David's triumph was heard throughout the land. Okay. Maybe the last one's better. Last one's in the New Testament, and that would be a Honda, because the apostles were in one accord. Okay, I give up. No more. I promise. I'll leave the jokes alone next time I do a Bible study. Got a question for you. Do any of you have any favorite Old Testament books? In the Old Testament, what's your favorite book in the Old Testament? Okay. What else? Ruth? Who said Ruth? Bless you. I'm glad you said that, because that's what we're looking at tonight is Ruth. So hopefully somebody was going to say that. I love Ruth. I read the Bible through and when I get finished reading it, I just turn around and start again. And sometimes I'll read it in different ways. But I always look forward, no matter how many times I've read Ruth, I always look forward to reading it again. Such a great story. Who wouldn't enjoy reading about Ruth? Here we have a Gentile woman, and she's undeservingly comes to Israel, to Bethlehem, and she finds a kinsman redeemer who redeems her, and she becomes a part of history. She becomes the grandfather of David, the greatest king, and then Jesus is in that lineage, the King of Kings. And so who wouldn't like the book of Ruth? It's a wonderful story, and it's one that God provides for us. It was some people say that Ruth is not an actual person or actual story. It is. There's no doubt about it. It's an actual event that took place in history with an actual people, and it's a wonderful story to look at. Now, what do we know about the book of Ruth? We don't know who the book, for sure, who the author of Ruth is, but tradition tells us that Samuel is probably the author. Now, the events of Ruth took place during the time when the judges ruled, and Ruth would have been born sometime around 1150 BC. Sure you want to know that. And the book of Ruth covers about 11 to 12 years. And so with that in mind, turn to Ruth, and we'll begin with chapter 1, if you can, if you would. And I'm going to read just to begin with. We'll read quite a few verses, and so keep your Bible open if you would. But I'm going to begin by reading in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem and Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. And they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. And these took Moabite wives, and the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. When we read this passage, it brings up some questions. First of all, the first question is, what was the spiritual condition of Israel at that time? If you look at Judges 17:6, it says this: in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in its own eyes. And so what was the spiritual condition in Israel at that time? Just felt like it is right now. Just look around. If you don't know what the spiritual condition of Israel was back then, just look around and see what it's like now, and it's about the same. It's amazing, but everybody's doing what they think is right in their own eyes. Then, same is true today. That would bring us to the next question. The fact that the spiritual condition of Israel is what it was, did that have anything to do with the famine? Were they experiencing famine because of the spiritual condition of the people? We have a problem. Yes. Let me read a passage here. This is Deuteronomy 11:13 through 17. And what this passage is God is giving instructions to the nation Israel. And so reading Deuteronomy 11:13 through 17, it says, and if you will indeed obey my commandments, I command you today to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. He will give you rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, in your wine, and your oil. And he will give grass in your fields for your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. Take care lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving you. God made a promise to Israel. He said simply this: if you'll serve me, if you'll just serve me and nobody else, then I will take care of you. All you have to do is, and all they had to do in this case, all they had to do was turn back to God, and then there would be no famine. Okay? That was it. Now, do you think that has any bearing on us today? I know that specifically doesn't apply to us, but in a sense, does this apply to us also today? If we turn back to God as a nation, would it have an effect on what's happening in the world and what's happening to us? Certainly so. I believe that sincerely, that if we would turn back to God, it'd make a huge difference in our nation also. Now, in verse 1 of Ruth, chapter 1, it says they went to sojourn in the country of Moab. That is, the plan was this. They went to live there for a short time. They weren't planning on staying there forever. They just wanted to be there for a short time, and that was it. Now, the next question is this. Do you think it was wrong for this family to move from Israel into Moab? What do you think? Was it wrong for them to do that? Yep. I believe so. I believe it's very. Why would it be wrong? Why was that a problem? My thought is this: is that they felt like they could not survive in Israel. They would be saying that they did not believe that God would provide for them there, and so it was saying in its real sense that they did not really have. They were really depending on their own abilities and not trusting in God. And so I think that's the picture we see here. And so anyway, they get to Moab, and things go south very quickly. We see the death of Elimelech while his two sons are still there and unmarried. And after the death of their father, we see the two sons married women from that country, Ruth and Orpah. Now, after this, both the sons died, and now all of a sudden we have these three women as widows, and Naomi without a husband or her sons. And that would bring up another question. Was the death of the husband and sons of Naomi God's judgment? Well, here's my answer. I don't know. I think there's a good chance it was. I don't know. It doesn't specifically say so. Does Naomi think it was God's judgment? Certainly so. Later on, we see that Naomi says, when she comes back to Bethlehem, Naomi says, God has dealt bitterly with me. And so she certainly felt like it was God's judgment. And was it? I think it was a pretty good chance that would be it, that would be true. Now, in the balance of chapter 1, we see that Naomi learns that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And so we see that Naomi determines that she would return to Bethlehem. And so she turns around and she talks to her two daughters-in-law, and she tells them, look, you're not from Israel. You're not part of our people. It'd probably be best if you just went back to your homes, went back to your families, and you lived there. You're established there, and you're comfortable there. That would be the best thing for you, is just to go back to your own homes. And of course, we know what happened. Orpah did not return. She did return to her family, but Ruth would not. If you read verses 16 and 17 of verse 1, it's one of those beautiful verses, or one of those beautiful passages that I just love to read. And she said this, and she told Naomi this: do not urge me to leave or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. What a wonderful, that's just an amazing thought process on Ruth. It's a wonderful statement she made, and also a statement of faith. When she said that, she made a commitment, and she said that she had committed her life to the God of Israel. And so she said, your God will be my God. And so she had turned away. This is a pretty amazing thought process. She had lived her entire life worshiping a false god, and now she meets Naomi, and she's introduced to Naomi. She gets to know Naomi, her mother-in-law, and she comes to have a faith in the God of Israel and the true God during that time, during that process. An amazing turn of events. And so at this time, we see these two women. They are returning to Bethlehem, and they're returning at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, think about what it would be like for these two women heading back to Bethlehem. I don't know how old Naomi was. It'd be hard to say. She's probably in her 50s. Ruth is probably in her 20s, something like that. That's just a guess. We don't know. But they're two ladies. They're by themselves. They're heading back to Bethlehem. And this is what they said about that day and time. It said to be a childless widow was to be among the lowest, most disadvantaged classes in the ancient world. There's no one that supports you. Back then, didn't have any kind of government support or anything, and so in their cases, they were by themselves, and you had to live on the generosity of strangers. Naomi had no family in Moab, and no one else to help her. And so for us today, if you were in that situation today, it'd be a difficult situation, would it not? If you lost all your family, if you lost your husband, if you lost your children all at one time or in a short period of time, would that be a difficult time? And you had to take care of things, you had to be responsible for yourself. It would be a difficult time for us even today. But in that day and time, it would be a desperate time. It wouldn't be a difficult time, it'd be a desperate time. Because you had no hope necessarily of any kind of help from anybody else. The government wasn't there to help you. You didn't have a church to help. I mean, it was just a tough time. Now, the question would be this. When Naomi and Ruth started back toward Bethlehem, do you think they were worried about what was going to happen to them? Yeah, certainly so. I think they would have been scared half to death. Now, this is something interesting. We look at this and we think, yeah, but God took care of them. I don't think God had sat down with them and told them what was about to happen in the next few years, huh? I don't think that's the case. God did not communicate that to them. And so at this time, all they were doing was doing it by faith. And that's what we see. And so that takes us to chapter 2 of Ruth. And let me read verses 1 through 10. We can't read, I don't think we could read the entire book, so I'm just going to skip through and read several of these passages, some of those that make sense. It says in chapter 2 of Ruth, beginning verse 1, says, Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to now listen to this. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. What a deal. Who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered, The Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, She is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. And then Boaz said to Ruth, Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go not after them. Have I not charged the young man not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and she said to him, Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? In this passage, we meet Boaz, and he was a relative of her husband, of Naomi's husband, and he was called a worthy man, or a man of valor. It would seem that not only was Boaz a very good man, a worthy man, but also that it would seem that he was a wealthy man. He had accumulated a lot of finance. He had become financially wealthy during that period of time. That being that thought, keep that thought just for a second. Over the last few years, evidently Boaz had accumulated a lot of wealth in Bethlehem. Now, here we see Boaz. He stayed in Bethlehem for the last 10 years, and during these 10 years during the famine, he and others in Bethlehem did much better than Naomi did, right? Naomi was suffering, went through some difficult times, and yet Boaz stayed in Bethlehem, stayed in Israel, and even became wealthy. It would seem that it tells me at least, that Elimelech and his family would have been better off if they would have just stayed there in Israel, stayed in Bethlehem and trusted God, that he would provide these things. Now, let me make a statement here. What if I had been in the same situation? What if I had been there and there was a famine in the land? Would I have stayed in Israel? I don't know. I would hope so, but I wouldn't bet on it. It's easy, to do these things, and I'm not sure I would have made a better decision than what they made. And so it's easy to say this is what they should have done, but at the same time, is it something I would have done? And I just don't know. But as we look again at the story, we see the attitude and the ethics of Ruth. she asked, she said, Naomi, is it okay if I go out in the fields and gather grain for the two of us? Can you imagine what kind of work this would be, how hard this work would be to go out and gather grain? I mean, this was back-breaking, difficult work, hard work, out in the sun, bending over constantly, carrying stuff. It would, and she was not afraid of that. And back in that day, the Mosaic Law provided some for the poor people. And what would happen is this: when they would harvest a field, they were literally to cut corners and leave the edges of the fields unharvested, and the poor people could come and harvest those corners. And then the other thing that would happen is, as the reapers would get these bundles of grain and put them together, if they were to accidentally drop one, then they were commanded, you just leave that one on the ground and the poor people will collect that. And so God did provide for people back then who didn't have opportunities, just as long as they would get out there and do that. And so we see that this is probably why Ruth did so well. Boaz went to some of the guys and said, hey, when you're gathering up this grain, just accidentally drop some on the ground. Just make sure that Ruth is able to, gather up. And that's what happened. And so she did very well. And so then, again in verse 3, it says this, that she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Do you think she just happened to come to the field of Boaz? There's no way, folks. This is God's plan. And we know that she's there. Why do we know she happened to end up in the field of Boaz? Because she ended up in the field of Boaz. God's plan is going to come through. I mean, it will always come to happen, whatever God's plan is. And so, not a coincidence. It was just the plan of God. And we can also see in this passage that Boaz was kind to the reapers. It gives us a kind of a vision of what kind of person Boaz was. And evidently he was liked by the reapers, because he came to them and he says, the Lord be with you, and then their response was, Lord bless you. Boaz had a good relationship with the workers. He was a well-liked man. He was probably a very good person for that day. And so we see things start making progress in verse 5, and following, Boaz looks into the fields, and he says, Ruth says, who is that young woman out there? And it says, it would seem that Boaz noticed Ruth, but we don't know exactly why. Maybe this. First of all, she was a stranger. Now, Boaz probably knew most of the people of Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a small community, and so Boaz probably knew most everybody. And so that would have been one thing. The second thing, I think she was very impressed. I think he was very impressed by the way she was working. She was a hard worker. She got out there and was getting after it. She was doing a really good job. And so I think that's why we see that Boaz notices or takes notice of Ruth. And then Boaz speaks to Ruth and he says, stay close by the young women. Now these were Boaz's female field workers who tied, when they would cut the grain, they would tie the stalks of grain together. And Boaz told Ruth to stay close to them and that she would be well taken care of. And he said, do not go into another, and do not glean in another field. God was blessing Ruth already, and because he had guided her to Boaz's field, Boaz knew that if Ruth stayed in his field, she would be blessed and find. One, in Boaz's field, Ruth would find companionship. She would get to know some of these other women, and she needed to have friends at this point in time in her life. And so by staying in the same field, she would get to know these young women. She would have companionship among these women, get to know some of the people of that area. Second of all, in Boaz's field, Ruth would find protection. Boaz said, have I not commanded the young man not to touch you? And so as long as she stayed in that field, she had protection. Boaz was going to look after her. And then also in Boaz's field, Ruth would find refreshment. He said, when you get thirsty, the young men are going to be providing water. They're going to be providing all you need. You just take advantage of that. And so the kindness of Boaz was wonderful. Now, at this time, do we see any kind of a romantic attraction between Boaz and Ruth? Not necessarily. We really don't see that here. There's no indication that that's happening. We don't know. The other question was this: do you think Ruth was a pretty woman? And if she was, after she worked in the field all day, what's she going to look like? I mean, probably pretty rough. I mean, that's pretty hard work, pretty sweaty, pretty nasty, pretty dirty. And so probably the thought process I see is that she may have been pretty, may not have been, but even at this point in time, Boaz was not necessarily attracted to her because of that. Yet, for whatever reason, Boaz extended this kindness to her. Now, the reaction of Boaz to Ruth to Boaz is understandable. In verse 10, it says that she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and she said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" What a beautiful picture, and what a beautiful picture of our relationship with Christ. That's what I think when I read this. Why would Christ pay any attention to me? Why would he look at me as a foreigner and have any desire to do anything with me? But he did. What a wonderful picture, and we see that reflects in our Christian lives. And then in verse 11 and following, we notice that Boaz was aware of what Ruth had done for Naomi, and that she had left her family behind to live in a strange land. And Boaz also knows that she has turned to the Lord, and that the Lord is the one under whose wings, and he says, under whose wing you have come to take refuge. And so what does that tell us? Evidently, when Boaz noticed Ruth, he did a little investigating. He did a little checking out to find out who she was and find out a little bit about her. And so that's the situation. And so at mealtime, Boaz tells her to come and to eat with the reapers. And Boaz provides for her, and she even had enough to take back to Naomi. It said she ate until full and had enough to take back, and she had enough to take back and provide for Naomi. What an amazing thought process, that she was a very considerate woman, and she was always thinking about somebody else. And so later that evening, after a long day's work, Ruth returned to Naomi and told her of what had happened in the kindness of Boaz. And it was then when Naomi found out that Boaz was a close relative and was one of our redeemers. And then Naomi instructed Ruth to continue working only in those fields. She said, "Hey, you go out, you keep on gleaning the barley, you keep on doing that, but you stay in that one field. Don't go anywhere else." And so then we come to chapter 3, and in chapter 3 we see this. We see that Ruth and Boaz are around each other to some degree. Now, in that day and time, how much dating did they do? They didn't, did they? It's a different story, wasn't it? Does that seem strange to you that they wouldn't date back then, that there was no dating? So how did they get to know each other? Yeah, here they are. They are together to a degree, but they're always together with other people. It's always, a group of people around. And so what they can see is this. If you spend some time with other people, you can get to see what kind of people they are by the way they interact with others. And this is what Ruth could see, and this is about Boaz, and this is what Boaz could see about Ruth. They could see how each of the others reacted among the people around them, and it told them what kind of person they were looking at. And so we see that Naomi tells Ruth what she is to do that evening. She comes up and she tells Ruth, you need to do this. Now, ladies, I think this is always good advice if you're going to go after a guy, okay? Kind of listen to this. It's a good idea. It says, clean up. I think that's good advice. Go take a shower, put on some perfume, and put on your best clothes. Good advice, I think that's good. And then she says, and after everyone has eaten, they will go, and they're going to go lay down on the floors. Now, why did they go? They would go down and sleep on the floors where where they had put the grain. Why would they do that? Well, they had to do it for protection. Back in that day and time, there were people who would come, and if they did not sleep around the area where the grain was being harvested, people would come and steal the harvest. And so they had to physically stay there where the harvest was and protect the grain. And so Naomi goes around, turns around and says, "Now, Ruth, you notice where Boaz goes and where he lays down, and then after he lays down, you go and uncover his feet, and you lay down there." Okay. Now, first of all, was there anything improper in this, in her doing that? No, not at all. This was not an improper thing she was doing. But here's the thought. Don't lose sight of the larger picture. Ruth came to claim a right, and Boaz was her Goel, which would be her kinsman redeemer, and she had the right to expect him to marry and to marry her and raise up a family to perpetuate the name of Elimelech. But Naomi wisely counseled Ruth not to come as a victim, demanding her rights, but as a humble servant, trusting in the goodness of her kinsman redeemer. And so she said to Boaz, in doing this, "I respect you, I trust you, and I put my fate in your hands." And so that's what she was doing at that point in time. She knew that he was a near relative, and he could act as a kinsman redeemer. Let me jump back here. Let me read verses in chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 8 through 13. And it says, "At midnight, the man was startled. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet." It startled me too. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, that you have not gone after a young man, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do all for you that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman, a virtuous woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. And so remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." Again, nothing improper about this. This was not a sexual advance on her part. What she was doing when she said, "Spread your wings over your servant, for you're a redeemer," she was saying, "I want you to marry me, and I want you to protect me." That's the picture. That's what she was asking of Boaz. And so the response of Boaz was immediate. He said, first of all, he called her worthy. He called her a virtuous woman. And he turned around and said, "It's true. I am a redeemer. I am a redeemer. But there's one closer. If the closer redeemer would not redeem you, I will." And we see that willingly Boaz wanted to do that. And so, again, we don't know what Ruth looked like, what her physical appearance was like, but I think in this case, I think Boaz was more attracted to her being a virtuous woman than her physical attractiveness. And which is more important? I tell you what, the spiritual condition and the moral condition of being a virtuous woman is more important than what she looked like. And she may have been a beautiful woman, I don't doubt that. But I think these other things are far more important. And I think that's what Boaz was looking at. And so that brings us to chapter 4. So look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. And it says, "Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there." Now he'd go to the gate because when you had business to do, you would always go to the gate of the city. That's where all the business dealings took place. And so it says, "And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by." So Boaz said, hey, Fred, come over here. No, he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And so they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi has come back from the country of Moab, selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. And so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." So he was the next kinsman redeemer in line. And he said, "I will redeem it." And then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead and his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Boaz was a man of his word. He told Ruth, he said, "Next day, I'm going to go check this out. I'll go take care of it." He said, if the other guy wants to redeem you, there's not much he could do. But he went to the gate where they do the business, and he turned to the more near kinsman redeemer and said, "Will you redeem Naomi's land?" And the other guy said, "Yeah, I'll do that. I'll be glad to." But then Boaz turns around and tells him the rest of the story. He said, "Now, if you redeem the land, you also take Ruth to be your wife and perpetuate the name of the dead." Now, here's the thought, my thought. It's only my thought. But I think that when Boaz went to this man, he had a pretty good idea of what the answer would be. I think he knew if this man would be the one, would be the redeemer, or if he would not. And so when the guy said, "Yeah, I'll do that," then Boaz said, "Well, now, if you buy the land from Naomi, you also take Ruth to be his wife." Now, it brings up a question. The first kinsman redeemer said no. Was it wrong for him to say no, do you think? Let me tell you what I think. I don't think so. For this reason, the guy was already married. And so by carrying out the wishes of Ruth and by buying this land, it would mean that he would take on a second wife. I don't think that's what God intended here. If you read what John MacArthur says about that, he said, when it talks about the nearest kinsman redeemer, it means the one who could appropriately carry out these duties. And so I think the first kinsman redeemer was correct in saying, "No, I don't want to do this," because this would mean having another wife and doing these other things. And so I don't see that this was a problem. I don't think he did wrong by doing what he did. Now, I could be proven wrong. I wouldn't be surprised. But that was my thought process. And so it brings about a question. What are the qualifications for being a kinsman redeemer? What did a kinsman redeemer look like? First of all, he had to be a family member. Jesus added humanity to his eternal deity so he could be our kinsman and save us. It had to be a family member. The kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying family members out of slavery. Now, how does this apply to Jesus? Jesus redeemed us from slavery to sin and death. Isn't this a beautiful picture of what Jesus did for us? It really is. The kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying back land that had been forfeited. They forfeited the land because they had to. They could not continue to afford it. And then next, Boaz, as kinsman redeemer to Ruth, was not motivated by self-interest. He didn't do it for himself, but motivated by love for Ruth. Jesus' motivation for redeeming us is his great love for us. Jesus did not redeem you and I because he would gain something from it. He did it because he loved you and I. What a wonderful thought process. Can you imagine that? That's where she had the problem. She kept on thinking, why would Boaz redeem me? I'm not worthy of being redeemed. I don't deserve it. I'm a foreigner. She was a Gentile. You know, there was no way that she felt like she deserved being redeemed. I don't either. I don't feel like should Christ have died for me? No, but he did, and he did because he loved me. What a great thought! What a great thought process. Boaz, as kinsman redeemer to Ruth, had a plan to redeem Ruth into himself. And some might think this would be foolish because he was not gaining anything from it. But Jesus had a plan to redeem us. And some might think that plan to be foolish, saving man by dying for them on a cruel cross. Yet at the same time, the plan works, and it's a glorious plan. It's a wonderful plan. And then last, Boaz, as kinsman redeemer to Ruth, took her as his bride, just as the people Jesus had redeemed are collectively called his bride. The story of Ruth is certainly a wonderful story, but it's a very beautiful picture of Jesus also. And so we know what happens from here. Boaz and Ruth, they got married and they had a child. Now think about that just for a moment. Naomi and Ruth had been in a desperate situation, right? Just a short time before this. And now all of a sudden, Naomi and Ruth have been provided for. All of a sudden, Naomi has a grandson. Ruth has a son. Everything is, God has provided wonderfully for them. What a wonderful picture, Ruth, and think about this. Ruth was a Gentile, and yet she's the great-grandmother of King David. She's a Gentile, and yet even more important, Jesus is in that lineage. She was the great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus. What a wonderful picture that is. It's a great book. It points to what Jesus did for us, and I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoy Ruth so much. Well, y'all have anything else you'd like to? Any comments? Well, if not, let's stand up and we'll have a word of prayer and we'll go ahead and leave. Appreciate y'all coming tonight, and go back home and enjoy the rest of the evening. Verlin, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer, please?